I live in a not-so-great neighborhood where power outages are a common occurrence. They can happen anytime, whether it's in broad daylight or in the middle of the night, which is the worst. I share my home with my mom and two little brothers. Because our area is so prone to blackouts, my mom had bought a bunch of flashlight lanterns to scatter around the house. In case the lights went out, we would have one handy wherever we were. My younger siblings are terrified of the dark, and it's no fun dealing with their screams and crashing into one another when the lights suddenly go out. This particular night was like many others. The power went out around 8 p.m., just as it was getting dark. I managed to settle my siblings down and turned on all the flashlights and lanterns, strategically placing them in different parts of the house so we could see. Once my siblings were asleep, I headed down to the living room. Our bedrooms were on the second floor of our 2-story house. I spent a couple of hours playing on my DS, feeling extremely bored with nothing else to do. Eventually, I found myself just staring up at the ceiling. I must have dozed off because I woke up a couple hours later. My DS still had a bit of battery life, so I resumed playing. As I played, I heard a faint noise from the front left of the house. In the living room, the couch faced the TV in the middle, and our front house windows were on the right. To the right of the windows was our front door, and there was a hallway directly behind the couch, leading to a staircase to the second floor. I didn't think much of the noise, so I went back to my DS. A few minutes later, I heard another thump, and this time it seemed to come from the front window. It was more noticeable this time, so I set my DS down and listened. I could hear a faint creaking sound, but with the pitch black outside, I couldn't see anyone. Still, I didn't give it much thought. Houses make noises. I walked over to the kitchen and started making myself a sandwich, using the light from one of the flashlights. I turned them off one by one as I moved towards the kitchen, preparing to head up to the bedroom. After finishing my sandwich, I chugged down a Pepsi. The lantern was on the counter, and as I turned to head up the hallway, I noticed that the front door was wide open. I stood there, completely frozen, because I hadn't heard it open, and I could have sworn I had locked it before. I didn't know what to do. As I took a step towards the door, I saw something in all black clothing glide past, almost like it was floating. I caught a glimpse of a cloak touching the doorway. Terrified, I ran screaming up the staircase, waking both of my brothers in the process. Reaching their room, I did my best to barricade the door. The scariest part was the absolute silence. I heard nothing. No one coming up the stairs. Nothing. I would have heard it because our stairs creaked once you got to the first landing. I waited for about 15 minutes, shushing my brothers and holding them. In hushed silence, I heard the front door close. The moment the door closed, the lights came back on. In the light now, it was much less terrifying, but we were all still scared. I waited for an additional 30 minutes, reluctant to go out and risk getting hurt with my brothers still there. Finally, when I mustered the courage to step out, I made my way slowly down the staircase. I made it to the foot of the stairs and looked over to the front door. It was closed. I grabbed the kitchen knife for safety and checked every room, but there was nothing, and nothing was missing. It was one of the most bizarre experiences of my life. I was 21 when this happened, and I'm not sure if it was a regular thing in my town or the nearby area, but I wasn't the only one who experienced it. Summer had just arrived, and with the unbearably hot weather, it wasn't unusual for neighbors to be on their front porches or outside in the evening. On this particular night, as darkness set in, I opened my windows and front door, enjoying the background noise of my neighbors while I sat at my island watching TV. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving only a faint glow from my open door. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way to the front door. Stepping outside, I peered down the street. It was still light enough to see. A few neighbors came out, and Charlotte, who lived directly across the street from me, called me over with her flashlight. We chatted about the weather and the lights when all at once the street lights flickered back on. We found ourselves standing in the street when they lit. Down our road, we could see people were standing beneath the street lamps. Our road was pretty long, and they were in twos and threes, scattered either near or directly underneath the street lamp. They were eerily swaying side to side. Some shuffled down the road. The closest street lamp was a few doors down, and as one of the people stepped into the light, their eyes rolled back into their head. That was the only unsettling detail. I looked over at Charlotte, and she whispered that we needed to get back inside. I agreed and rushed back across the street to my house, shutting and locking my door and watching from my windows. A couple of them had moved into the neighborhood. I could hear some yells, I guess, in response to the people. I tried seeing where the noise was coming from, then I heard a couple of shots, and then a conglomerate of voices and screams. I got down on my stomach, moving as far away from the windows as I could. Through the screams, I could hear groaning. It only lasted for a couple of minutes, and then it was dead quiet. Afraid to get up, I stayed on the ground for a while until I heard a couple familiar voices, one being Charlotte. I peeked out my window and saw a couple of my neighbors talking in the street again, their arms moving wildly. I got up and walked out my front door again, asking what happened. A couple of houses down, I guess, one of the people got too close, and a man set fire on them, shooting one of them. Of course, I didn't see what happened after, but Charlotte told me that they all in sync started running back down the road in that same weird shuffle way, with their eyes still rolled back in their heads. Since I know I wasn't the only one who experienced it, the cops were called from multiple people in the neighborhood. They said that they could search the neighborhood in the neighboring town, but that was the last we heard about it. It was pretty unsettling considering how many people were out and about. With that amount of people and them acting so oddly, I would have assumed that they would have been hard to miss. It never happened again, though, and still to this day, I'm not quite sure what to make of it. My story happened during Hurricane Irma in 2017. The power was out for weeks. Most of the streets were flooded, and our town was in literal shambles. My dad, always ready for anything, had a bunch of supplies, so we were doing okay. Despite the danger, he went out occasionally to check on neighbors and give them supplies that we could spare, something I've always respected him for. One day it rained heavily. The flooded streets looked like an ocean had ran through. Dad had left in the morning, promising that he would be back soon enough. The day drolled on, but my dad usually got back before it got too dark. The later it got, the worser the weather got, and with no lights, it got darker inside quickly. The flooding was bad, and we started worrying about him. My mom and big sister went out on the roof to see if they could see him, yelling his name, and using binoculars that my sister had found in my dad's desk. They insisted that I had to stay inside, but they had to come back because of the heavy rain. It was clear he wasn't around, and with the weather and roads getting worse, we knew he wouldn't be home. In situations like that, your mind goes to dark places. Hurricanes are tough, and we feared the worst. I remember falling asleep next to my big sister that night, saying a silent prayer that he would be okay. Mom kept waking up, going to the roof periodically to see if she could spot Dad's flashlight, just in case he was nearby. When I woke up the next day, my father still wasn't back. We kind of lived in a 2-story place, not much of an apartment really. The bottom was where my parents had their store, but it was totally flooded by then. The water was almost at the stairs leading up to our apartment, so we kept the door shut and used sandbags to block it, hoping it would keep some water out. Our apartment had access to a roof, so we could see a good part of the neighborhood, but with the weather getting worse, everyone was too scared to go up, worried they might get swept away by the wind. Another day passed, and my dad still wasn't back. As I mentioned, my mom kept going up to the roof all night and during the day, shouting my father's name. If the weather was too bad, she'd come back really quickly. Other times, she would stay up there. Sometimes my sister would go up with her, and every time she would come back looking serious, saying she'd try again later. Days went by and still no sign of my dad. I could sense my mom losing hope, and the fear that my dad might not be alive kept me up at night, along with everything else happening. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, just as my mom was about to go outside to see if she could spot my dad. I asked if I could go with her, and she agreed. It was lightly drizzling. Nothing too bad. She opened the door to the roof access and led me up the stairs. It wasn't as dark as I thought. I could see the damage caused by the hurricane. About 2 blocks down, some houses had been swept away. I hadn't realized how bad the flooding was. The houses next to us were still standing, but I could see families on roofs lower than us. It broke my heart to see our town like that, and it made me worry about my father even more, and the potential lives that had been lost due to this hurricane. Once again, my mom sat down with the flashlight she was holding and called my father's name a couple of times. I joined her for a moment, looking over the neighborhood. The water was moving so slowly. It felt like we were literally sitting on an ocean. I was searching the area, calling my father's name with my mother, when across the street I saw a flicker of light, pretty low to the ground and close to the water. I stared at it until I realized it was someone smoking a cigarette. It was light enough for me to be able to make out a man sitting on what looked like a damaged car. The car was wedged into the street, water rushing by. It was a strange thing to see considering the danger we were all in, that this man was just sitting out in a hurricane. I continued calling for my father, sneaking a glance at the man every now and then. I whispered over to my mother that there was a man watching us, and she followed my eyes to the man, who had now stopped smoking and was just sitting there staring up at us. "Do you need help?" my mother called out, first in Spanish and then in English. The guy just kept looking at us. It was getting darker, but I could see a frown start to form on my mother's face. She ushered me back inside and said that if I was up again the next time she went, she would take me with her. We went back down into the apartment and fell back asleep for a couple of hours. The rest of that day was horrible. The wind was so loud and strong it felt like it was going to break through the windows, but thankfully we stayed put. Despite my mother's wish for me to stay inside, I wanted to go out and call for my father again. She allowed it surprisingly. In the terrible weather, she held tight to me, screaming our father's name repeatedly. But as we called, my eyes flickered to the same spot as last time, and a man was standing on what looked like a pile of lumber, squeezed between 2 buildings. It was a few feet away from where we had seen him the last time. Water ran along his feet, and it seemed like he was staring directly at us again. I was fairly sure he could see us just as well as we could see him. I stopped and pointed, asking my mother who that was. She glanced at him for a moment and told me that we needed to go inside. That night we had dinner quietly. My father had bought a radio, and although it was sometimes unclear, we thankfully heard news about help on the way. It lifted our spirits. That night, we all went back up on the roof, and once again, we called my father's name for a couple of minutes, looking around while it was still light enough to see. However, this time, I didn't spot the man. My sister did. He was sitting on top of the flooded car again. One leg hung off the car with water running over it, while he had his other leg up and his arm resting on his knee. It was my mother who called down to him again, asking if he needed any help and if he was stuck. It was light enough for me to make out his features. Hair covered most of his face, with a head full of bushy eyebrows and a really thick beard. But his eyes had this strange gleam that I didn't quite like. It's hard to describe, but it was pretty dark at that point, and yet I could still see his eyes. He hadn't responded to my mother's questions, and with the way he was looking up at us, my mother gave a light wave to him and took us inside. We didn't go out for the rest of that night. With that man outside, I didn't feel any safer, and I really wished my father was home. During the night, I woke up to a series of bumps and thumps on our roof. I lay still, staring up at the ceiling, trying to hear any wind or pounding rain, but all I heard was the bumping. I looked over to see where my mother was, and she was standing near the door to the roof access with what looked like one of my father's shotguns. My heart started racing as I suddenly realized what was going on. I sat straight up, feeling my sister's arms wrap around me, covering my mouth. I could hear what sounded like footsteps coming down the rooftop door, as someone started jiggling the knob, trying to get in. They fumbled with it for a minute and then started banging into it, trying to put their weight against the door. My mother briskly called out in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish fluently, so I didn't catch what she said. At the sound of my mother's voice, whoever it was stopped and started talking from the other side. The voice was very low, and I'll never forget the tone. It sounded eerie, striking fear in my heart that I can't quite explain. Whatever he said made my sister hold on to me tighter, and my mother pointed the gun at the door. She said something else in Spanish, her voice strong. Still, I didn't understand, but then there was silence. We stayed up the rest of that night, and in the morning we were woken again by the sounds of something on the roof. I shot straight up, looking for my sister, who was already by my side. She woke my mother up quickly, and my mother grabbed the gun again. She screamed out in English this time, telling whoever it was to get away from the door. With a sigh of relief, we heard my father's voice yelling our names. We all ran out and up the stairs to see my father, wet but alive. He hugged and kissed all of us, explaining that he got trapped a few neighborhoods down. People there had tried barricading an area of the street to keep the water out, but it broke, flooding the remaining part of our town. He apologized for leaving and scaring us all. After he changed into some clean clothes and had something to eat, my mother told him about the man we had seen. My father's face grew cold, and I heard him curse under his breath. Apparently, the guy we saw that day was a customer of our store who had a falling out with my father. Apparently, this falling out happened just before the floods and the hurricane, and my father guessed that he had stuck around the store waiting for him, but found us instead. Whatever sick intent he had, no one really knows, but the look in his eyes that day suggested he couldn't have meant well for any of us. I'm so glad we found my father, or better yet, he found us. We never saw that man again, and by the time we were rescued, my father had tried to file a report. However, with the town so flooded and destroyed, it was fairly hard to find him again. Stay safe out there, guys, please.